I'm working together here with a team of colleagues who put together the workshop with me. They are mostly sitting at that table. Amy Bartlett from the Open Forum for CSO Effectiveness, Greg Adams from Oxfam, and Netsanet Belay from CIVICUS. So it was these 4 organizations who put together this workshop through a collaborative process. Just one word about ICNL, since we have been, it is our core mission to promote an enabling legal space for civil society. And you heard, before the break at the plenary, you heard from Maina Kiai the kind of a rights framework that was developed for civil society organizations derived from existing international law instruments. And that rights framework was actually developed with the leadership of ICNL a few years ago. So that's where we come from, that's our main contribution to this field. And of course, we have been a key players or actors in dreaming up and making it happen, the position for the UN Special Rapporteur. So we're very pleased to have Maina here with us today. Let's start our discussion about the enabling environment, which is the core issue why we are here. And all of us have some strong feelings, I think, when it comes to the CSO space and the space that we are allowed to act. So I would like to ask Maina to join me for a brief discussion about what that means in practice. And while you're coming here, I must say that we are very fortunate that we have the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of association and freedom of assembly with us today, because he is one of the few people who are in a unique position to, on the one hand, understand our issue and, if I may say so, feel with us on this issue, but on the other hand is also in a position to actually have serious influence among the donor organizations and partner country governments based on your position. And so what I would like to ask you actually in the beginning is what is, when you accepted this position, you must have had something in mind about what you would like to do or what you can achieve with this position, how you can help civil society. And in the plenary in the morning you said that you see your role as a tool, like our tool to help us advance the cause. But beyond that, what is your ambition? You know, what is your vision with the position that you are in?
Thank you very much. Let me say that the UN Special Rapporteur in protecting human rights. So anytime anybody is appointed to one of those mandates, I think it's something that you have to think very carefully about accepting, because you're put in a unique position of being independent, but also being part of the United Nations system. So I think that's the best part of it, that you're there as an independent person, but you've got the UN essentially behind you. When you speak with authority of the United Nations. When I was appointed, and I was appointed just this year, it was an easy choice, a very easy decision to take, because I think that this mandate is special. It's as you know, it's brand new. It was enacted in 2010, in October 2010, when it was passed by the UN Human Rights Council. So it's a unique opportunity to be able to push something I've been doing all my life, and one of the things I've been doing all my life is working for human rights at various levels. And it was clear to me, even at that point, that the considered challenge, or the considered nexus between economic rights and civil rights is actually the freedom of association and of expression. Now, when the mandate was passed in 2010, the clear motivating factor was the environment for NGOs and civil society space and the freedom of association. That was a real big thing. But then by January, February, before I was appointed, I think the world had seen now the freedom of assembly as the most important thing, with the Arab Spring and people rising and moving. And I think it was important then to see that. It was good, I think, because it then creates a very clear distinction, if you wish, between freedom of assembly on one hand and freedom of association. Even though they're very much linked, but you can have association without assembly. You can have assembly without association, if you wish. But they're very linked. But then you can't, but in every sphere of our world, and I think when I was talking this morning to one of my friends, I said that really the defining moment in human rights history is 1993 at the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, which then linked irrevocably with the Vienna Declaration both economic and social rights on one hand and political and civil rights. I think that was a historical moment in a sense, and I think that this mandate gives us all a chance to push that duality of human rights together rather than one after the other. So this whole idea of first generation, second generation then is avoided because it's really together, you push them together. So I think that to me has been one of the most important things.
So how can you do that very concretely? So what are the things that you can do to push that?
Well, the first thing is that when you look at the mandate as the resolution that creates the mandate, the first thing I have to do in June next year is present a report that looks at best practices in terms of freedom of assembly and association. Now, what I've decided to do is that as you look at best practices, I think it makes sense to look at worst practices as well. So what I'll be doing is presenting a report that looks at best practices legally, best practices in practice, but also worst on both sides. So I think that's going to be interesting in terms of how that is received. But ultimately, I think one of the things that you can do as a special rapporteur is apply the moral pressure on governments to open up space, to cause rethinking, to give them a bit more pause. And so far, the little time I've been here, we have by speaking out sometimes, by sending out what we call urgent alerts to governments, you can see sometimes they delay. You're never sure that they will actually move, but at least they delay and pause, and they feel they're constrained to react, and they react to you officially, especially after you do a public statement, which is good because that creates space. And I also, one of the things when I said I want you to use me as a tool is that then whatever statements that I do, please use them. And I've seen some NGOs are doing that already, some civil society organizations, they say the UN Special Rapporteur say this, and so they use them as building blocks for their own work. But I think ultimately the clear thing that we would like, all of us, I think one of the things that I have in my mind is that at the end of my 3-year term, is that I would like to come up with some, if you wish, UN guidelines on freedom of assembly and UN guidelines on freedom of association, in a sense which will be best practices. I won't be creating new law, but it will really be extracting from the different conventions and practices, what is best, what really is the guidelines that can then be used as soft law to move the agenda. But that's on a legal level, and I think sometimes we focus a lot on the legal level, and I'm also very, every time I do this kind of things, I am very focused on what happens on the ground. And if so, one of the visions I have on the ground is being able to create some space, if you wish, especially for civil society or for people in government who want to extend space in their countries. Give them the space, use that mandate, use my platform, if you wish, to be able to expand that at a practical level. It's one thing to have good law, it's another thing to have good practice, and I think that's a challenge wherever we are.
Can you say of an example when your statement or letter or moral pressure, as you called it, actually caused the government to delay? I think there's a part where we did a letter to, we did a public statement on Cambodia in terms of space, and I think there has been reactions to that by the Cambodian government in terms, even if delaying. I'm a realist in these things, and I do appreciate that when governments want to push something, they will push it. They may delay to let go of the pressure, but oftentimes they'll continue. So it at least creates a little bit more time and energy for people to act against it is good. So Cambodia is one. The other one actually is Israel, and Israel has been considering, as you know, law, and they were supposed to go off to the parliament to do something, and that's been delayed a little bit by parliament. So those are two examples I can think of right offhand where it's that. But the other bit of it as well is trying to simply trying to get into countries. The way that, again, the mandate works, the mandates work is that for me to visit a country, I have to get an official invitation from the government. So I have put out requests to governments and so far some have accepted. I think the one that's been most surprising acceptance was Syria, and I will be doing a mission to Syria pretty soon in the next few months. I think that's a very interesting one. But usually the normal suspects agreed, and I think the UK is going to be interesting in terms, because I'm going to do a mission to the UK in terms of how they deal with freedom of assembly and the riots that happen in London, but also the aspects in Northern Ireland in terms of the marches there. That's more geared towards freedom of assembly and association.
There's also Georgia, which I'm going to be looking at in terms of again, freedom of association in the next few months. So there's a few of them, but the one I would really like to get an invitation from Ethiopia, especially, but I think that might be a bit hard to get. But I will keep pushing and see where it goes. But I think the countries that are unique, Ethiopia would be useful for me. I think there's some other countries in Asia, of course, if they invite you, be happy, like Burma, but you don't hold your breath waiting for Burma to invite you. So you have to find ways of working around that.
So how can you work with the civil society organizations in all this? So if you think, like, if several people put up their hands that they have a difficult situation in their countries, so what can they do to involve you and have you help?
Well, I think the first thing that is important is just giving the information. I mean, just give me the information. Don't assume that because I'm called an expert that I know it. In fact, half the time is that we don't know it, we just pretend to know it. So give me the real information, we'll check it out and see where it goes. So just accurate, timely information of events as they happen. Secondly is when I can let you know which countries I've sent letters asking for invitations, and you can pressure your government if you can to extend an invitation to me. The third thing which we are now going to be doing a little bit more of is where I don't get an official invitation by the government, I can still attend conferences, I can still attend academic events, I can attend workshops. I mean, one of my colleagues, the Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Assembly, actually attended a protest of freedom of expression, attended a protest in Algeria, and he was right there in the front line during the protest, and they dare not beat them or tear gas them because they don't know what reaction will happen. So there are innovative things that we can do where we can join up with you to do some of these things. So, but clearly just have a dialogue with us. Approaching me is easy. If you look at the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, go to Freedom of Assembly, you'll find the website there. We will also be creating, hopefully, a new internet platform where people can access us much easier than that. So which will be linked to the UN website. So a little bit outside the UN, but linked to it. We'll be doing other things around that.
And I think we will hear a little bit more of Cambodia case soon, so I'm not going to ask you about that, but I think also there it was not the case that you paid a visit.
No, I haven't visited yet. In fact, I haven't gone to any visit, a country visit yet. But the other bit as well is that I'll also be upscaling over next year, especially a series of consultations within the region. And these consultations, if possible, I will do them with government on one hand, but also with NGOs on the other hand. I think it's important. And some places where I can do a joint consultation, the better. Where I can't do it, then I'll do one at a time and over a visit. I think that's an important place where you can feed in and give me information and other things. But the other thing I mentioned this morning was about the questionnaire. And please fill that questionnaire. It's important. It's a really important tool because it's something I know, and I know how governments work. Most governments will just ignore it. So you have a chance then for me. I'm not going to give. I sent to the governments. They didn't respond. The response I got were from following NGOs, and that's what happened. So I'm happy to use that as in my report. But that kind of process will be continuous over my term. I'll be consistently consulting to hear what's going on the ground, to hear evidence. Then of course the reports that I make. I have a report to make at the Human Rights Council in June, and possibly I'll make one in October at the UN General Assembly. And those reports can have a high value in terms of addressing cases. And I'm not one of these people who shirks from naming names. I'm very happy to name names. I think it helps. I want to name names because it makes more sense and gives it more humph in terms of moving the report.
So is there a specific website, for example, where people can approach you, or is there an email address, or how does that work? Yeah,
if you go to the Office of the High Commissioner, where ohchr.org website, and then you'll scroll down, you look for the freedom of special procedures, then you go through that, you'll find freedom of assembly, the special mandate. But the email address to use is easy, it's freeassembly@ohchr.org. That's freeassembly@ohchr.org. And then you can also use my personal email, which is for this work, which is Maina Kiai, is my name as one word, .sr@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you, Maina. I have one more last
at gmail.com. mainakiai.sr@gmail.com. I had to create an independent email. Sorry? Maina Kiai as one word, which is MAINAKIAI.SR@gmail.com.
Thank you very much. You will have the opportunity to ask Maina questions shortly. Before we do that, I would like to ask our next guest, Borithy, to come to the panel. And Borithy is, of course, I think most of you probably know him. He's our leading figure in the fight for civic space in Cambodia, and the head of the coordinating committee of CSOs. And I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about the case that Maina already mentioned. And this is a concrete example of what, how we can collaborate between these institutions. But before we get to the concrete collaboration, what were the issues that you had to fend off? What were the key problems with the government?
Thank you very much for the honor, and I'd like to correct the description about me being the single person that is the main driver of this movement. It has been the power of solidarity. At national level, we have to collaborate with other brothers organizations, such as some of them are present here. We've got the NGO Forum, and we've got many other actors in the country that we have worked in solidarity. And that solidarity has go up to the regional level, as well as to international level, as well as reaching the UN system. Maina has said this morning to use him. Cambodia has successfully used him. He spoke up in Geneva a few months ago alongside Soya Sobedi, Special Rapporteur for Cambodia on Cambodia issue. And that is really a credit to the slow-moving UN system. Slow, but at some point effective. So that give me sort of a short introduction, and I'll respond to your question now. The problem in Cambodia is, of course, the upcoming legislation on NGO and association. It's been on the table for the past 3 years, and it's a timing whereby the space for civil society in Cambodia is under serious threat of shrinking, and this directly implies a shrinking of democratic space in Cambodia for civil society, in the sense that CSO seem to be the last political force to hold the government and many other actors in the country accountable for what is not right. We become a political nuisance, so it's time within the country whereby there is a dominant political party that is controlling the executive, the judicial, as well as the legislative. So if we're talking about a system whereby the power is centralized, passing a legislation of this nature would be done at the speed of lightning. But it has not happened because of the movement of solidarity and the tenacity and the willingness of the Cambodian civil society to really respond to this threat. We have the plan of the government to have it out and done with by Easter this year. It has not happened. We had put up repeated petition outlining our concern and our recommendation about what is not right about the law. One of them being the non-compliance to many international treaties that Cambodia has signed up. Second is about the poor articulation about right of appeal within the law. And third is about compulsory registration.
How does this argument actually come to life? What makes it work?
Cambodia is a young democracy. And a young democracy is also trying to claim international visibility and international credibility. So, whether you like it or not, pressure from a world organization like the UN system, from a collective donor community does have an impact on the government. Cambodia will be hosting ASEAN next year, and will be chairing ASEAN for the next 2 years. It's trying to claim a seat within the Non-Permanent Security Council. All those things imply that the country need to respect international democratic principles. If it has not done so, it just minimizes its chances to gain international recognition. So those are the arguments that we have to use to really push the way of our advocacy further and broader.
If I can ask you to give the mic to Maina for 1 second, what would you say about, because you see different countries in different positions and they all have different interests and political context, so what would you say, what arguments really work with the governments in this case?
Well, I think the biggest, the single most important reason where international arguments work is if the country is seeking something at the international stage. If it doesn't need it, and if it's got other ways of claiming that recognition, then it doesn't care. So you've got to take a power calculus, in a sense. You've got to do a balance sheet of where the power is, what they're trying to achieve, because some countries will buckle. But I think what's interesting though, looking at different countries, there's some countries that are very particular about following law. It may not be international law, but they'll create their own national law, even if it is repugnant to justice or repugnant to human rights. They'll create a national law that they keep. Others just don't give a damn. No law. They'll do whatever they want.
Back to Borithy for a final question. What is the situation now? Because all of this movement has led to some progress, maybe.
Thank you very much. I would caution the progress. The Cambodian government is very smart, and we internally believe it's still a political maneuvering just to gain time and also to test the water. And we appreciate all the level of support and solidarity being pledged to all of us, whether it be at the donor community level, CSO level, including the UN system. But one must think that unless the international recommendation and the CSO recommendation are taken fully on board, this still poses a serious threat to Cambodia. So we are questioning the definition of what voluntary or non-mandatory registration means. We're questioning the right to be explained why registration will be denied or suspension will be made. And we're also questioning the legitimacy to have this law in the first place within a political context that is not really conducive to having such a law.
I just want to say something about, we just follow using the example of Cambodia, but also more broadly for the work that we all do here. And one is, I think, the interesting linkage, as you mentioned, between the service delivery civil society and the advocacy pro-democracy civil society. I think one of the things we have seen, and I'm now speaking as well as somebody who's been part of civil society and is still part of civil society in my real life, is this division is a one that it can be a worrisome division. And I think there is a need, maybe not at this forum, but at other places, where this has got to be constantly interrogated. Why does civil society have these tensions between service delivery versus advocacy civil society? I think that hurts us all, because as again the Ethiopians will tell you, when repressive laws are put in against civil society, they affect not only the advocacy ones, but also the service delivery ones, and perhaps even much more so. So in a sense, we are all in this boat together, and I think there is a need across both sides to work together, to reach out, to understand each other better, and I think that's one of the things we have to do. It's not just about humanitarian aid, it's not just about anti-corruption work, it's not just about human rights, it's not just about building wells and giving HIV drugs across the world. It's actually everything together. And I think the most successful civil society organizations are those that traverse that divide quite effectively, and it can be done. The other thing to say, I think, is that it's thoroughly important, and for all of us to understand that the international level can only be supportive. It cannot lead, and it can only follow the lead of domestic action. So it's got to be a lot of work done on the ground by civil society themselves that makes it easier, in fact, then for international actors at whatever level to come in and actually claim a space to push the agenda forward. If there's nothing happening on the ground, if civil society is quiet, it's not doing much, and waiting for the Special Rapporteur, waiting for the UN to come in, or the EU, then you're going to wait for a very long time. Because because I think the key thing is that we define our role as supporting rather than leading those challenges that are there.
Thank you, and I encourage all of you to take mental notes at least of all these points, because these will be very important when we start talking about what concretely to do and how to strategize for the outcome document and for post-Busan. And what you said about the importance of leading at the grassroots level is a very nice kind of way for me to invite Netsanet to the panel. And Netsanet represents CIVICUS. So please also introduce yourself just briefly. And my question to you will be, we heard a concrete example here and some that Maina mentioned as well. How many examples are there out today?
First is an easy question. I'm Netsanet, I'm with CIVICUS, I'm the current Policy and Research Director at CIVICUS. And I'm also Ethiopian. I've faced persecution in Ethiopia for 2.5 years, and I left the country because they don't want me around anymore. And I just warn you that even this very conversation that we're having today, the very response which I'm about to give now to your questions, even sitting next to the UN Special Rapporteur, is considered legal under Ethiopian law. This very statement we're having now. Me as an Ethiopian, making a statement that amounts to advocacy on human rights under the current laws of the country, representing an international organization, is an illegal exercise. The worst part is if you dare to email this conversation as well to your colleagues in Ethiopia, and if they choose to disseminate it around to their constituents, they are committing an illegal act. So this is how severe the situation is. But Ethiopia is not unique, and Cambodia is not unique. We believe that the trend of shrinking space for civil society, attacks on fundamental freedoms that underpin citizen engagement and civil society activity is in danger globally. We've seen a number of examples over the past 2 years particularly, where governments have used both regulatory, legislative measures as well as the classic attacks, harassments on civil society organizations all over the world. And there is a common misconception that this is considered as a problem of the Zimbabweans and the Ethiopians and the Cambodians. It's not. It's happening in the UK, it's happening in the US, it's happening in Denmark, and it's happening everywhere. So it's both a global north and a global south phenomenon. We can cite a number of examples to that effect.
But there is certainly a difference between the level of oppressing fundamental freedoms as opposed to cutting budgets for development aid, which is more the northern examples that you mentioned.
Indeed. I'm not even mentioning about the funding pattern to CSOs in the north. We're discussing about how governments view the fundamental freedoms for citizens, expression, association, and assembly, and how they choose to regulate that in the respective jurisdictions. If we look at recent practices and policies even in the north, Maina mentioned the UK's and the way they regulate assembly. We're looking at, under the guise of counterterrorism, security, and etc., we're looking at a number of highly restrictive policies, regulations, and practices being implemented even in the global north.
My own country, Hungary, included. Absolutely.
Indeed.
Absolutely. So you mentioned this issue with the counterterrorism. So how do you see the relationship between the whole aid effectiveness agenda and overall debate and the justification for the restrictions on civic space?
Well, governments have come up with a number of rhetorically appealing justifications for restricting civil society space, right? It includes counter-terrorism measures, civil society activity, and any form of associational life is considered a threat to security. Governments all use other excuses like legitimacy and accountability of civil society organizations as one justification for regulation. But most interestingly now, particularly when we're discussing this under the HLF4 umbrella, we've looked at certain countries even using the very principles enshrined in the Paris and Accra declarations as justifications for further restricting civil society organizations' right to access funding, to operate freely in their own national constituencies. Examples from Sierra Leone to Zambia tells us that governments are actually, for instance, construing and interpreting this concept of country ownership to mean government's ownership and leadership of how development works. And at a practical level, it means that a group in Sierra Leone cannot implement a project or idea that it thinks is innovative and useful for the community unless it signs and secures permission to the government. And if that's not viewed as aligned to the government's priorities, it cannot implement it. So you see how these novel ideas and principles developed out of the debate are being used as tools and instruments for repression and attack. And that's why yesterday I was raising this during the preparatory discussions as well. If there's anything which we cannot afford to see in the HLF outcome, is lack of clarity of concepts. Because we believe that the vagueness of the terms is opening up room for further attacks and etc.
That's very important. Thank you. So what other, because with CIVICUS you have a big membership and you have worked with many countries and CSOs in many countries. So what other forms of advocacy do you see successful? We've talked about, on the case of Cambodia, we've talked about coalition building and a strong presence both of the local and the international community. We talked about, of course, the help of international instruments and the Special Rapporteur position. What are the ways of advocacy that are effective?
Of course, the most important strategy, in our opinion, based on our experience, is to ensure ownership, local ownership of the advocacy efforts. I think that's essential and central to any form of advocacy we design. But we've seen a number of examples where solidarity actions have really brought about concrete change. It's very interesting to see when, in a few examples wherein a draconian restrictive measure being introduced by a certain government in the south, when it's been challenged and disputed by international organizations or any other groups, didn't get any traction. But we've noticed how a local group from Pakistan showing its solidarity to a Venezuelan group and signing a statement and sending a letter to the minister in Venezuela, at least they managed to get an official response from them. It shows how, the South-South cooperation and indeed ownership of the issues by citizens globally really brings about that change. But the key components are pretty clear: ensuring ownership by national groups and citizens of their own issues, ensuring providing that level of international solidarity, using existing international and regional human rights bodies and mechanisms to influence change, and most importantly, which from our experience is to detect threats as early as possible and try to ensure that we tackle them through dialogue and other reform initiatives as soon as possible before they materialize into concrete threats.
Thank you. All right, so we are advancing towards the time when I will ask all of you to be part of the discussion. I have a last question, which is a kind of fortune-telling question, and it's for all of you. So if you want to respond, all of you can respond. When I'm from Hungary, as I said, and when my country in 1989 transitioned into democracy and we had our revolution back then, there was, I think, a general feeling around the world that freedom has come, and there was an overall feeling of the importance of freedom is undisputed, and that was the overall trend that we've seen. And 20 years later, it's almost like we are at the other end of the pendulum, where unanimously all the countries from all continents are moving towards more authoritarian and more restrictive political systems. So my question is, how far is this current trend going to go? Do you see it still as something that is not just where we are today, but 2 years from now it will be worse around the world? Or do you see some signs that it might actually change, that there may be, I mean, we had the Arab Spring, we had, you know, what is it, what is your sense of where we are going now in the next 3 to 5 years? Can you give the mic?
I want you to start because I can borrow some more from. I think there is both reasonable ground for optimism and pessimism.
That's such a diplomatic response.
Try to do that. Definitely, more than ever, 2011 has demonstrated to the world that citizens can claim their destiny, that they can decide exactly how they wish to be led and governed. And that has really resonated globally. We've seen how mass social movements are springing up from New York to Cape Town, from Tunisia to Ethiopia, even in small scale. And I think that has sent a clear signal to government that indeed questions of participation, citizens' role is central, and I think there's ample potential in it. And civil society as well has traveled quite a distance in designing effective advocacy strategies, using technology effectively, and etc. So I think this is really a good potential in it. On the negative side, there is no doubt that there is a huge vacuum in global governance at this stage. Governments are completely absorbed in their own internal affairs. There is no visionary leadership. There is no moral authority globally, whether you look at the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the African Commission, whatever. There is no ethical leadership out there, and that's a serious threat, particularly in promoting international norms and principles and etc. So this is where I see it heading.
Thank you.
I tend to agree with Netsanet, but I have a few things to add. The timing is very short for CSO, whether it be national, regional, or globally to react, because the landscape of how the world will be governed will change through economic forces and through emergence of new character that will be ruling the world. Now, if the equation is going to be like this, we have a serious problem, because new players do not care about governance or civic engagement. I'm sure you know what I mean. I don't need to elaborate or name the country by their proper name. Thank you.
Just perhaps the only thing to add is that your question, I think we need to look at it in the context of the global financial crisis that's going on, and the impact that's going to have. And I'm not so sure that the new world order that emerges will not be unaffected by the global financial crisis. I think that even as Europe shrinks and America shrinks, that has impact on the rising powers who basically export to these countries. So that will be having its own issues. And I think if there's one lesson we can take from the Arab Spring is how little we know and how little we can expect in the continuous journey of human beings towards freedom. I think that's the one thing we can rely on, is that human beings will not stop seeking freedom. They have sought it from the days of slavery. They've sought it, in the civil rights movement. They've sought it in the women's rights movement. That's what freedom. It's the one defining thing that moves us all as people. It is freedom. And I think the other lesson we need to learn, even in this part of the world, is really from South Korea and the Asian tigers. And I think there was a point when it was all about economic growth and development and military governments and dictatorships that were abounding. And then all of a sudden, after the crisis in, I think, in 1987, is when it really started changing. Well, it changes, and now Asia really is now beginning slowly, but surely, I think, moving towards freedom and democracy. I think that's the enduring struggle of humanity, which is seeking freedom. So I think, and I will never underestimate that human spirit to seek freedom. And even though we may not know when the next spring will be, we know there will be a winter somewhere for sure in some places in the world. And I think the question is what will germinate from that winter across the world, what kind of force it will be. I think the challenge for all of us as civil society is being prepared for that kind of germination of the next summer that will happen, because it will happen. And we may be surprised that there may actually be some places we never ever expected But I think this is a continuous struggle. I don't think it will be resolved in our lifetime. I think we'll be continuously seeking freedom, and others will be seeking to take it away from us. That's a continuous struggle of life. I think at some point we may be ahead, and then times we'll be behind. I think that's the best you can say about it. It's just that I think all of us would want our countries to be moving ahead rather than moving behind.
Thank you very much. Beautifully said. Now I would like to open the floor for two things. One is questions, of course, if you have to the panel. And second, of course, one of the main assets that we have here for Maina is all the stories that we have from our own countries. Who wants to start for the final round of reflections? You don't have to answer everything, just whatever you feel.
Yeah, I was going to do that anyway because some of the questions are not really related to me. I'll touch on the issue of co-op by government. Yeah, the co-option by government. This is a natural phenomenon that is happening within ASEAN and in many parts of the world. I think you have to keep your intelligence vibrant and really recognize who are the genuine CSO and brother and try to work within those frameworks. There's no way we can stop that movement at all, but you just need to understand that you need to play a little bit of politics to really include or exclude those people. Sometimes it's excluding them to get the intelligence from where the government is going. But when we talk about major advocacy movement, particularly in the case of Cambodia on NGO law that is affecting the entire spectrum, of course we're not going to engage with them, because they would just be the bad element within the advocacy movement. So that is the straight answer to that. On the issue about why can't the same strategy used in Cambodia be applied in Russia or in Ethiopia? I think it's a different political context, and one must remember that the UN brought Cambodia out of the Holocaust and really put democracy or initiated democracy in there with the assistance of an international conventional donor. And this is something that is a fact. This is how Cambodia came back to life after the genocide. So there's a history in there that those players are accountable to. So to let the democracy mushroom up and then shrink, that's not fair to the Cambodian people. Why give them a chance and then kill that chance later? On the issue on the legislation, the double standard, I cannot answer that one. It's just the way it is making. On the first question, I think, is about the differentiation about aid going there, or maybe I misunderstood this question. There's too much distance between the provider of humanitarian aid and the people that are receiving the aid, and that is not really the right picture. I may have misunderstood that one. Anyway, that's all I can share.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, some of the points made, I very much agree with them, and some of the evidence generated by some of the organizations around this table is also suggesting the same issues. We're clearly looking at a backlash against protest and assembly for fear of other social movements emerging in different countries. In Africa particularly, we've seen in over 35 countries either direct or indirect forms of backlash on freedom of assembly happening only in the past few months. And the trend is the same in Asia and in Latin America. So that trend is clearly there. Governments are scared that the peaceful protest needs to be regulated, and that's happening. Internet is being tampered, and there's a lot of move towards hacking and controlling text messaging, media, etc. So that's really the threat which we need to watch out. It's also true that co-optation is a main agenda issue indeed. Governments are actively pursuing to set up Congos, to manipulate agendas, and etc. The solution, I believe, largely lies internally, in how civil society groups internally manage to set up self-regulatory mechanisms, hold each other accountable, and sort of peer review each other on this set of principles. Once again, really reaffirms the need for a more national-centered advocacy and work around this. On the issue about development indicators, there's no denying that there is a lot of politics behind how countries are ranked on development horizons. Even if we leave the politics aside, I think there's clear recognition now that the governance and development indicators out there have really failed to demonstrate and to give a full picture of how that government is doing in the overall human development dimension. You know, the case of Tunisia and Libya is a clear evidence where countries were ranked highest are now in this social crisis. That needs to change, and I think the cases in point and the trends now are showing it. And indeed, there are recent now moves and measures to try and rethink the way we assess governance, the way we assess development as well. We've seen a number of initiatives with UNDP to rethink the governance indicators. We've seen new moves towards re-examining our human development indicators and etc. And hopefully that will substantially provide new frameworks. And I believe CSO's role comes into that as well, to really interrogate these findings. And I think the main point is how we succeed in depoliticizing this rights agenda. I mean, that's what is where we're failing, whether at Human Rights Council, Security Council, regional bodies or elsewhere. Due to lack of ethical leadership and political will, I believe the rights agenda is too politicized and hence all these problems. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting point, to depoliticize the rights agenda.
I think we've talked a lot about the Arab Spring as a watershed moment for us. But I think we need to also look back a little bit at the massive changes that have happened in Latin America in the last 10 years. And I think one of the most amazing things that's been quiet has been the huge progress of democracy and of development, and in terms of growth in Latin America over the last 10 years, quietly, without much fanfare. But there are now probably maybe one or two countries only that don't have free and fair elections in Latin America, which is a huge step ahead. And Chile is outstanding, Brazil is outstanding. I mean, they're now beginning to lead, and I think one of the big indicators for me is the question of gay rights, LGBT rights in Latin America. For 10 years ago, if you ever went to an international meeting and the issue of gay rights was put on the table, you would be sure that the Arab states would raise opposition, the Africans and the Latinos, consistently. Today, people pushing gay rights is Latin America. It's always the front one. So it's a sea change that's happened that is part of the processes. Now, I raise that because so that we just don't look at the massive visible changes we see. The changes can happen in a progressive way, sometimes under the table without us seeing. And I think that we need to give credit when that happens and learn from it, so that perhaps the next step for us may not be an Arab Spring. It may be a Latin American example that's going to focus on Ethiopia and affect it. I think that for me is an important part of it. On the funding issue, I think we have to talk about how the international community funds, and I think that's an important question that was asked, because it has to be unmasked, I think, and I think part of the role of civil society is to unmask these differences between funding for Ethiopia and funding for Eritrea. It has to be unmasked. Why one and not the other, and make it clear, so that if governments, if donor countries are going to fund Ethiopia because they are fighting Al-Shabaab, then say so. Let it be clear. Don't start saying it's because development is the key. And that makes everybody's life a lot easier, and I think we can then contest that and be able to engage on that in a much clearer way. So I think one of the roles for all of us here is also to keep challenging, not just our governments, but also the international community. It must be challenged. It's, they don't get it right half the time. I think not half the time, 3/4 of the time they get it wrong, and the amount of money that's wasted in terms of this development cooperation is tremendously high. And I think the other trend as well, which we'll have to address at some point maybe, is the question now that as the global financial crisis happens, we are seeing the bureaucracies of international development cooperation shrinking. So money stays, maybe reduces a little bit, but the bureaucracies shrink. So the tendency now is to write out blank checks to governments and say, spend. So they tick the box and say, we have done that, we have spent the money. There's an issue there where we have to be able, and I think this is where now North-South collaboration makes a lot of sense, because there has to be pressure put in terms of where does the tax money from the North, the global North, go exactly when they're writing blank checks as budget support, or they can't change the projects even though things are fundamentally changed there. The last thing for me, and I think the two things I want to say, just one. One is the role of China. China is emerging, and so right now it looks very sexy. People are going to flirt with it. They're going to try and seduce it and be seduced by China. But eventually China will be treated just like we treat the United States. If it gets to a superpower, it will be treated like the United States. There's no doubt. I mean, that's the way human beings operate. And I think you're seeing that happening, that the Chinese workers have been kidnapped in the Niger Delta. Much to the shock of Chinese, because they always thought at first only the Europeans and Americans are kidnapped in Niger Delta. But they didn't realize that the bandits there, as long as you're a foreigner, you're making money out of the oil, you're a target. And the same thing would happen. I think we're making too much of this China and world role. I remember as well among the emerging countries that Brazil and India are places where which have got democratic forms of government. So we all focus on China and forget India and Brazil, where we should be able to intervene in a different way. And I think I'm not as pessimistic about China. I think as China rises, it will get more and more scrutiny. Finally, for me, this issue of cooptation, I think it's a thing that I think it's a clever strategy by governments to co-opt people. I think that speaks a lot about us rather than the government. That we have to ask ourselves, why do we do this? Why do we do this work? Is it a job to get a paycheck at the end of the month? If it is, then we will be co-opted. Absolutely, and that's part of the process. So I think as we have gone on with processes of civil society development, as we become more professional, when this doesn't make a difference between advocacy and service delivery, the more professional we become, the more we tick boxes, the more it's just a job to get a salary. Then yes, we will be co-opted. We will be co-opted, and I think that's part of the process. So we need to look at ourselves quite deeply and figure out, why do we do this work? If we do it because we believe, then we can't be co-opted. That to me is an important part of the question we have to ask. Why do we do this work? And I think that whether it's service delivery, if you want to alleviate poverty, you're doing it with a mission. If you don't do it, you're doing it for a job. Please go and work for a bank. Please go and teach at the university. Please go and do something else. But get out of this work and let's create space for those who really believe in what they're doing.